name's Adrian Owen. I work in Cambridge in the UK at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences unit. I'm a neuroscientist. I trained in neuroimaging in the early 1990s at the Montreal Neurological Institute in Canada. My interest over the last 10 years has evolved from brain mapping, really, frontal lobe research, into clinical applications of neuroimaging. The thing I'm working on for most of the time at the moment is using or developing techniques for using neuroimaging to investigate issues relating to consciousness, and in particular for looking for signs of residual cognitive function and perhaps even conscious awareness in patients who appear to the outside world to be vegetative. Mainly fMRI, but also more recently EEG, to see whether we can detect signs of residual cognitive function. Do these patients, are they still able to process language, for example? But also awareness. Can we actually show that some of them are not what they appear to be, are actually aware of themselves and where they are and what's going on around them? Earlier this year we published a paper showing that a patient in Belgium who had been assumed to be entirely vegetative for almost 5 years was in fact aware, but was also able to communicate yes and no responses by modulating his brain activity, and we showed this using functional magnetic resonance imaging. I think this is quite an important finding because it tells us that many of these patients aren't what they appear to be. Even though they can't move, they can't speak, they can't generate any form of physical response, they can nevertheless generate responses with their brains, and even in some cases might be able to communicate using that technique. I mean, I'm often asked the question after I talk about this data, well, you know, I don't really think this person was conscious just because they could answer yes or no questions. But, you know, this is really the thing that interests me. The only way that any of us have for knowing that another person is conscious is by asking them. There's nothing that we can do. There is no neuroimaging technique that we can use to unequivocally know that somebody else is conscious unless they generate a response. Now, what we're doing is we're using the fMRI machine as a way of getting a brain response rather than a bodily response. Now, typically when you assess a minimally conscious patient, the way we know they have some residual consciousness is we say, well, please move your right arm, and they'll move their right arm, and on that basis we conclude that they have some level of consciousness. And in fact, that's the only way that any of us can conclude that any of the rest of us are conscious as well. And really that's all we're doing with the fMRI technique. We're saying now, please activate your supplementary motor area now, and please stop activating your supplementary motor area now. For me, that has exactly the same level of same explanatory value as asking somebody to move their right hand, to raise their right hand. The reason why I like working in this area is because although I trained in functional neuroimaging, it was very much basic science. It was trying to work out how different areas of the brain work, what they do, and how they function. My particular interest was short-term memory and how the frontal lobe of the brain processes things in short-term memory. By moving into these new areas, I find it very satisfying because it provides sort of clinical application for some of this more basic science. And I think there are other areas in the future where imaging will really start to make an impact clinically, where up until now much of the impact has been at the level of basic science, I think. Clinical applications in neurodegenerative diseases, for example, and in conditions like disorders of consciousness present some exciting possibilities for these sorts of technologies in the future.